Chapter 1. The Emperor Arrives. Paul Dupree stood in the dim light of the antiques store, running his fingers over dusty relics and worn-out treasures. His eyes landed on an elegant crystal paperweight that gleamed faintly in the corner. It was simple yet ornate, with a faint shimmer beneath the surface, as if something ancient and powerful lingered within. His curiosity piqued. Paul carefully picked it up. "That belonged to Napoleon Bonaparte," the shopkeeper said with a crooked grin, noticing Paul's interest. Paul chuckled softly. Sure it did. He loved a good story, especially when it related to history, but he didn't put much stock in folklore. Still, something about the paperweight felt important. Beside him, Colleen, his wife, shifted her weight impatiently. "Come on, Paul, we don't need more clutter." "Just this one thing," he said, handing over the cash. He grinned at her, knowing she wouldn't say no to anything with a historical tie. After all, they both loved history. He just taught it for a living at Wilburn Academy in Janetville, Texas. Colleen rolled her eyes fully, accepting her fate as the owner of yet another curious trinket. The next day, Oliver Dupree, their 10-year-old son, found himself rummaging through his parents' study, looking for a pencil. His homework wouldn't wait, wanting to get it done before dinner. Always accompanied by his chihuahua, Pinata. Oliver's eyes landed on something new, the crystal paperweight his dad had brought home from the antique store yesterday. It sat on the large oak desk, catching the late afternoon sunlight. "Napoleon Bonaparte, huh?" Oliver muttered to Pinata. His dad had told him the story, joking about how it might be a magical relic. "I wonder what it'd be like to have the confidence of Agui like that," Oliver mused, holding the paperweight in his hand. His thumb absent-mindedly traced circles on its smooth surface. "Napoleon Bonaparte, huh?" Oliver muttered to Pinata. His dad had told him the story, joking about how it might be a magical relic. "I wonder what it'd be like to have the confidence of a guy like that," Oliver mused, holding the paperweight in his hand. His thumb absent-mindedly traced circles on its smooth surface. Suddenly, the room filled with a faint humming sound. Before Oliver could react, a soft pop echoed in the air, followed by a poof of thick, swirling smoke. Startled, he dropped the paperweight, sending it crashing to the floor, shattering into countless pieces. He tumbled out of the chair and onto the floor, wide-eyed and dazed. He grabbed Pinata, who was barking up a storm. When the smoke started to clear, a figure stood in the middle of the room. The man was short, but carried himself with an air of confidence that filled the room. Dressed in a dark military uniform, his face stern and dignified, he glanced around, confused. His eyes fell on the young boy peeking over the desk holding a small barking dog. "Who are you?" the man asked in a thick French accent, his brow furrowed. Oliver, still on the floor trying to hold Pinata, who was freaking out with a stranger standing in the middle of the study. Oliver yelped, "Dad?" Paul Dupree hurried into the study, his face a mix of curiosity and concern. "What's going on in?" His voice trailed off as he saw the man standing in front of his son, a man who looked every bit like the portraits of Napoleon Bonaparte from his history textbooks. "Who are you?" Paul demanded, though his voice wavered with disbelief as he suddenly wished he had some kind of weapon. The man straightened his posture, his eyes narrowing. "I am Napoleon Bonaparte," he declared. "And where, may I ask, am I?" Paul blinked, unable to process the scene unfolding in front of him. You're in Texas." "Texas," Napoleon repeated, the word foreign and strange on his tongue. "What is this Texas?" Paul Dupree adjusted his glasses, looking at the uninvited houseguest who was now standing in his study. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, clad in his uniform and looking rather unimpressed, had magically appeared as if he'd simply marched in from the 19th century pages of history. "Texas, huh?" Paul began, scratching his chin with a slight smile. "This is going to be a fun one." Napoleon raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Amuse me, monsieur. Where, pray tell, is this Texas? Another province of your endless etats." Paul chuckled. "Ah, not quite. See, Texas is a big state, one of the biggest states in the United States of America, that very country you made quite a deal with back in 1803. Napoleon leaned forward, intrigued yet suspicious. "Ah, yes, the Louisiana Purchase. A fine price for some marshlands and endless plains." Paul nodded, suppressing a grin. Well, turns out that marshland you sold us was a bit bigger than you probably realized, practically the whole middle of the country. You really gave us quite the bargain. The Emperor waved his hand dismissively. Minor transaction. I had an empire to run, wars to win. What do I care about vast, uncharted territories filled with bison? Right, right, Paul said, nodding in exaggerated agreement. But you might be interested to know that out of those lands eventually came a large part of America. Texas is actually a bit of a rebel story, started as its own independent country, then decided to join the US of A. Texans even fought Mexico for their independence. I'd say they've got a bit of that spirit of resistance you're fond of. Napoleon looked unimpressed but intrigued. A land of independence, you say? Not unlike France. Paul smiled, leaning in. More like a land of stubborn independence. Texans don't take orders lightly from anyone. They've got their own style down here. Big boots, wide hats, and a rather intense fondness for barbecue. Think of them as, how should I say it, the independent province that never quite stopped being a little wild. The Emperor frowned. And this land of yours, the United States, took in such fierce individualists? Oh, absolutely, Paul said with a smirk. Texans are fiercely proud and big on personal freedom. If I didn't know better, I'd say they'd make fine generals in your Grand Armée. Napoleon smiled at that. So Texas, a land of bold, defiant souls with a certain taste for grandeur. That's Texas, Paul said. A whole state that believes everything's better when it's bigger. You'd probably like it here. Napoleon nodded thoughtfully as if contemplating his own imaginary empire in the West. Perhaps I should have kept it for myself, Paul laughed. Too late, Your Excellency. You signed the papers. As Oliver slowly stood up, still holding Piñata, his eyes darted toward the shattered remains of the crystal paperweight on the floor. He gulped, realizing the magical object must have brought this strange man to their home. Dad, I think it's Bro, Oliver whispered, pointing at the shards of crystal. Paul rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of it all. Oliver, what happened? Oliver stammered. I was just holding the paperweight, and then, all of the sudden, he was here, pointing at Napoleon. Paul shook his head in disbelief. Okay, we'll figure this out. Napoleon glanced between the father and son, clearly agitated. The last thing I recall, I was eating soup on St. Helena, where I was exiled by the English after my defeat at Waterloo. And now, he gestured to the unfamiliar surroundings, now I am here, in Texas. Paul, still struggling to process the absurdity of the situation, glanced at his son. Oliver, go wash your hands for supper. He then turned to Napoleon, trying to keep a straight face. You must be hungry, sir, since your dinner was, interrupted. Please, eat with us. It would be an honor. Napoleon hesitated, but at the mention of food, his stomach growled. His rigid demeanor softened slightly. Very well, he said, nodding graciously. Paul left the study, muttering under his breath, This might be for a while. Colleen was standing at the kitchen counter when Paul called out, Honey, we have a guest for supper. She looked up, confused. Who? Oh, you'll see, Paul said, grabbing the plates. When Napoleon entered the dining room, Colleen froze. The man in her kitchen looked like he had stepped out of a documentary on the History Channel. He approached her, taking her hand and kissing it gently. Madam, I apologize for my sudden imposition. Colleen, still processing the sight of a man who had supposedly been dead for over 200 years, blinked and said, no problem. As they all sat down at the dinner table, Paul scooped a generous helping of hamburger helper onto Napoleon's plate. Apologize for the humble meal, but we're saving up for a family vacation this summer. Napoleon stared at the heap of saucy hamburger and spiral noodles. It was nothing like the fine cuisine he had been accustomed to, but his hunger outweighed his pride. He winced slightly after he jabbed his other hand with his fork to check if he was dreaming. No, this was no dream. He toyed with the food cautiously with his fork, his mind still reeling from the events of the evening. Paul gestured to the salad. Help yourself. As Napoleon took his first bite of the strange American dish, he could not help but wonder what fate had in store for him in this bewildering land called Texas. Hey, what a wild start. M.S.Weldon surely has a touch of dramatic. I wonder what happens in the next chapter. Do you think the story is as exciting as I do? And do you want to hear more? Then I encourage you to follow the link in the box below the video and buy the full version of the book.